sports are really important vehicles for relationships.
We have purpose. We have a why. We bring people together. We connect.
I feel like God is our greatest supporter and our greatest coach.
Welcome to Rabbi on the Sidelines. This is Rabbi Erez Sherman from Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. Today is April 15th, 2024. It's the Boston Marathon in the city of Boston. But 11 years ago, April 15th, 2013, was what is known as the Boston Marathon bombing. In that moment, we combined the intersection perhaps of sports and faith. And this week, we are joined by producers Loren Mendell and Omar Al Dakheel, who were two of the producers on the Netflix series American Manhunt, the Boston Marathon bombing. We're going to look into how those ideas of faith and sports intersected on that fateful day of Patriots Day, and what it has meant to America, what it has meant to the faith world, and what it has meant to the sports world. Loren and Omar, so great to have you. So, Loren, as we got to know each other through the sports world, through the faith world, and through the production world, you told me very quietly that you were working on this film, and last year it came out on the 10th anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombing. It's one of those moments when you remember where you were. As I just told you before, I was in the parking lot of Trader Joe's listening to KNX 1070, and they said, breaking news. Where were you actually on that day before you even started this film? If you remember at the time, where were you on the day of the Boston Marathon bombing?
It's interesting you should ask, because I was a father of two very young children, and I don't remember where I was, but I was probably carpooling
right here
to preschool here or kindergarten or something. So it's one of those moments for me that I actually don't remember.
And Omar, what about you? Do you remember?
I was in DC. I was actually in this kind of like volunteering in a place where it's like for international travelers in DC. And I remember that's part of the story you can talk about too, is like there was speculation that they might come to DC after because their uncle was in DC. And, you know, as a Muslim myself, it was really very, very uncomfortable for me. Like, it just like, I just didn't want to talk about it. It was just like everybody's talking about it in the news because it's suspicious if you talk about it, suspicious if you don't talk about it. It's like, it's like, I don't know what to do. And sometimes you just you just like nothing. But it was very difficult. And so 10 years later, when this project came, I was like, yeah, this is the time actually for me to do something about it and bring Muslims on the projects that can talk about it and openly and honestly, because it's really, I know Loren mentioned that like when we first worked, is like ask me about like, you know, when you find that somebody does something like that who is the same faith, like you just feel embarrassed or ashamed by default, even though you had nothing to do with it. And I think a lot of Muslims like myself, like since 9/11, it's like every time there is a bomb, I feel like, please don't let it be a Muslim, please.
And we have the same thing in the Jewish community, by the way, right? Oh my gosh, it's this name or that name. They must be Jewish, and we react a certain way because then how will people actually feel about us?
Yeah, and then you just put in a defense, position, which is very awkward, But yeah, so that's where I was. I was in DC, I remember. Yeah, for a few months when I was there, yeah.
And so I like to say we go from the ordinary to the sacred on this show, but we're going to start with the sacred because a Jew and a Muslim come together to work on a story about patriotism and sports. Loren, first, your journey to this film and why you decided to take on this project and the importance that you saw in the American Manhunt.
Well, my background is in documentary, and I've done a lot of sports-related projects. I used to work at Fox Sports and
World Series. Watch Loren Mendell.
Right. And the executive producer, Tilla Russell, was putting on this project through his company, and so he brought me on board. It's my former business partner. We made a bunch of movies together, and we hadn't worked together in about a decade, and he knew my background, and it was the perfect opportunity to get to collaborate with him again.
And what did you find intriguing that you wanted to tell this story to the public about specifically the Boston Marathon bombing?
Well, like you said, it's one of those moments that I think most people, besides myself, knew where they were, and it's one of these seminal moments in our history, and to be able to retell that story, but to dig deeper and find the meaning behind why this was done, how America responded, and what is the, when you're living history, I think that's the time to retell it and to tell it from all perspectives of the people while they're still here, while they're still alive, and to see who wants to tell their side of the story.
And then, Omar, you hinted at bringing a Muslim perspective into the show. You talked about the film school, and this is an opportunity to get with Netflix. Why say yes to something that you might have been afraid of, actually, in terms of how people would have thought of your participation in this project?
Facing your fears is actually a good thing, So I really wanted to face my fears, and I like a challenge. Usually when something you're scared of, that means something good will come out of it, and that's the actually thing that you need to do, And so I also felt responsible, and it's part of my responsibility. And as documentary filmmakers, we always want to tell the truth and want to take the truth. And then Tiller, it's not just me, Tiller, who, was the executive producer who brought us on board. He, I believe, he believed in me, but I also believe in him as a visionary person, and that he was really like great at bringing people together and hiring the right people to do the job. And so I was part of something called the Netflix Nonfiction Fellowship for producers, up-and-coming producers and directors. And we all went, me and Loren and Tiller, we went to the same film school, different years, USC film school. And so there's that also track record and trust, that they have in me from graduating from the same program, knowing the same professors and the same things that we took. But then when he told me about the show, I just felt like, this is the time for me to do it. And in retrospect, also for the people that we brought on board 10 years later, they, most of them were ready actually now to tell the story in a way that they would have not if it was very fresh when this happened. And so I think the timing worked, and, face your challenges always, and then, did really well. So I'm glad that it was top 10 on Netflix for a few weeks, and, they greenlit us now for season 2 and 3 for other Manhunt, so it become like a theme. Interesting. And Netflix, which I can't talk about the other seasons yet, but it's that intuition that anytime a project comes and you're like, is this something that, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but I thought I followed my intuition. And
so both of you are very humble in your work, and it's almost hard to get amazing answers because you're so humble about your work. And so I want you to ask this question. What is something that you learned from each other about, for instance, Loren, Omar coming on the show as a Muslim perspective, and Omar, something that you saw from Loren that you learned about the Boston Marathon bombing that you didn't know before? So maybe Loren, what did Omar bring to this that you could not have done without him?
Well, it's funny because when we were planning our first trip to Boston, when we were going to shoot a bulk of the interviews, we didn't know who was going to go on that trip. Some people will stay behind and work at headquarters, and some people will go. And all the people who were in charge, who had been in pre-production, we said, Omar has to go. I don't think he knows this, but there was a couple of us who stood on the hill and said, Omar has to go to this because we don't have the Muslim perspective yet before we left for our trip. And we were going to be on the ground trying to secure certain interviews to really get this additional perspective on the story, which is so important. Not only does it add credibility, but it adds depth to the story and it adds perspective. And so the way that Omar was able to talk to members of the Muslim community in a way that I don't think that I could have or would have gained the trust of them was essential to the success of the project and to getting some of the perspectives that you see in the series.
And Omar, what did you learn?
I learned a lot. I don't know where to start from, but Loren, I think, maybe the most intuitive producers that I worked with. Like, he pays attention to things that I wouldn't, like, a lot of times I would be reacting to something, but Loren is very proactive, very on top of it, but also very intuitive. He can tell, he can read people very well. Like, it's a really great talent, not just in filmmaking, but in life, is when you can get something out of people, what their concerns are, where they're coming from, He really knows how to put himself in other people's shoes, and very overly prepared. And he always kept me on my feet, And also he was like the father on the project, making sure everybody is like comfortable. Everybody is like, Omar, did you eat? It's like things like that.
My mom is like dad, and it's pretty good.
He's like such a, father figure also on the project. that it just really made it more like a family and not just like we're just there for a job, you know. But also really very trustworthy person. Like he's incredibly trustworthy, you know. And so to me, you know, the Jewish, Muslim, Christian, to me, it's do I trust you or do I not trust you? There's a lot of Muslims I don't trust. You know, it's not really that. And I think Loren is incredible at really gaining people trust. And that's why Tiller and everybody, Netflix trusts him. And, you know, Floyd, our director, also trusts him the most. The first person he turns to is Loren. So there's a lot.
And I want to focus now on the suspects and the victims. So I want to start with the victims because I think it's really important to, you know, even though the protagonists and the main characters are obviously the brothers, the people that really affected the most and live with us every single day are the victims. Out of all the people that you could have chosen, why do you choose people like 8-year-old Martin Richard and 29-year-old Crystal Campbell? Is it people that you just happen to find, or is it a specific reason that you find these victims that their stories are so compelling?
I think it's a combination of what you find in the research and also people self-selecting. I mean, obviously they didn't select to choose to have their stories told, but I think people in their lives who we had access to, who were willing to come forward and who were wanted to tell their stories. There were certain people we approached that weren't interested in talking. And I think that Crystal Campbell's story was one that we had access to people in her life who were willing to talk about that.
And that was 10 years later. She's 29 now, or she's 39 now.
No, you Christian. Who we talk because she passed. She died.
Oh, sorry, she died.
Her best friend that was with her in the marathon, Karen.
Right.
She was the one we interviewed because we thought, you know, or the director and everybody thought like we also want two perspectives: somebody who survived, but also somebody who is like their friend is gone. And it's also, you know, in a way different, but like the friend we had who was the friend of the bomber, we see somebody who is the bomber, and then we see their friend, somebody who died, and somebody, you know,
right,
or somebody who was in death penalty, somebody who survived. So it's like that kind of like parallel storylines of friends also was important in the story.
What about a child, like an 8-year-old?
The child, we didn't interview his family because his family refused to participate in any, even when they did the fiction film, which one of our producers, Michael Rudetsky, who did Patriots Day, good movie with Mark Wahlberg, they, you know, also that, like they couldn't even have like, you know, the access to the family or agree because they just refused to exploit the story. Right. For money or anything like that. So, and then there's a third person, I forgot her name, a Chinese student.
Lingzi Liu.
Yeah. Yeah. And then these are the three people that died. So we had to mention the three people that died because that's, you know.
Of course.
But yeah, I guess because it's also a manhunt, they wanted people who are alive to tell, you know, the story now.
And then have you been in contact over 10 years with any of those families now and seeing how their lives have changed or different types of things that they have done with their lives based on the experience of that day?
I have not. Now, remember, the documentary came out 10 years after the bombing, right? So when we were in production, it was, you know, 9 years after, and now we're at the 11 years after. So really probably from 9 to 11 in terms of how the documentary affected their lives. I personally have not been in touch with any of the subjects.
I have been in touch with the contacts, like Yusuf, for example. You know, I wasn't here, but he came, to LA, and we're still in touch. I'm still in touch with the Imam as well, and the Muslim community in Boston that I was in contact with. So I think the best thing after there's some sort of like, even for Karen, who was the friend of, one of the victims, is there's something healing about actually talking and doing this documentary. And then because in a way you kind of put it behind you, and then you said what you had to say, and then kind of like a closure to it. And I think that's like the significance of the 10th anniversary too,
for sure.
Which, you know, it was a long time, but it wasn't too long, but it wasn't yesterday. So I think that's also part of, you know, what we do as documentary filmmakers is to make people tell their story, and also there is some sort of like a relief, something that they can say. And from the people that I was in contact with, they were, and all the other producers and everybody they were in contact with, at least when we first released it, it was, overall very positive, their reaction of how they were portrayed.
And this idea of the American dream, specifically in part 2, comes about. And here are these two brothers, they're immigrants, and one of them is a boxer, perhaps even maybe going to an Olympic boxing, but can't because he's not an American citizen. What part of the story do you think that led to? Was it the, I can't fulfill the American dream? Or as you told me, Loren, it was using religion in the wrong way. How did those two things come about in the story that you learned something?
Well, I think that, as we discussed, religion has been used for wonderful things in the world, and also in the extreme, oftentimes it's used for violence.
Mm-hmm.
And in this specific case, there was some evidence of some mental instability,
Mm-hmm.
number one. Number two, there was some influential figures in this young man's life. Number three, his parents had left the country, so he didn't have those strong paternal or maternal figures in his world. And I think he was looking for something, and when failure came about and his dream couldn't happen, he turned to religion. And unfortunately, he turned to the radical side
Mm-hmm.
of religion.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't, in terms of how that relates to sports, I think that, or how it relates to religion in sports, I think he needed to do something. He wanted a call to action. He wanted something, a reason for being.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there was a lot of negative forces in his life that led him to a place that, 99.9999% of people would never go to.
Mm-hmm. And you said that actually, I just learned this today from you, that it might not have been April 15th, but they were trying actually for July 4th. Not necessarily a sports moment, but an American moment. It just happened that a sports event was on that day. Do you think that the sports world, for either of you, has been transformed or changed by this moment in terms of how people look at, obviously, security, number one, but what it means to gather? Because it was both a very difficult moment, and at the same time, very difficult moments can also be moments of unification. Just like September 12th was something even more powerful than September 11th, was April 16th more powerful than April 15th in this case.
Well, certainly, I think you have to look at it that way. It's on the response, right? What did America do? What did the people of Boston do in the aftermath of such horrific events?
Mm-hmm.
So when we look at the Boston Marathon now, they decided they were not going to be defined by this moment 11 years ago. And so instead, they decided to define themselves by the reaction to it and how people came together. The slogan "Boston Strong"
Mm-hmm.
is something that became famous and we saw everywhere, and it's still present in the city.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I want to go back to the failure in sports, because what Tamerlan was saying about him, it's rigged because he's a Muslim. I think that's BS, because there's so many Muslim athletes, Mike Tyson, Muhammad Ali, there's so many in basketball,
Mm-hmm.
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. There's just so many successful athletes, that dealt with racism and Islamophobia and so, I think that's, a lot of people who are, who fail at certain things and then you blame it on other things, it kind of just remove responsibility.
Interesting.
Because then it's, it's done to you, you're the victim, and you use that victim mentality, and then you go on this malice and revenge. But also I think, when we talk to a lot of people around him, not necessarily the ones that were interviewed, that there was something wrong with him, So the younger brother is the one who's puzzling everybody who's in max prison right now. That's the one who is puzzling to me, to all of us, to all of his friends, to everybody, is, what is really, because he wasn't a failure. He wasn't,
right. A good kid.
Yeah. I mean, at least from the people that knew him. But then something in college, and, his GPA dropped and everything, there's something wrong. I spoke to his uncle, and there's, things in the family. Like it wasn't I'm forgetting the word, but it's definitely not a stable family. Like his parents were divorced, and then they came back together, and then they left, and they came back. It wasn't it wasn't it was just not a stable environment. So the home was not really. And then also the crazy story, also like the wife of Tamerlan, who this white lady from New Jersey converted to Islam. To me, it's such a fascinating character. But also, what is her cause? What is her, because she showed no sympathy to the victims or anybody. So there's a lot of question marks, but legally she was able to get away with it because there's nothing, against her per se. And if you just keep your mouth shut, nothing will happen, which is something that I learned while, researching and doing this project. So I guess, the motivation, there is a clear motivation for Tamerlan, or at least symptoms or things that led him, but the other people are still... It's really puzzling. And, with documentaries, we try to answer these questions and ask, or at least raise the questions, but you don't always get all the answers. As far as...
Very Jewish thing, actually. We're about to celebrate Passover, and we get to the whole end of the Passover meal, and we're still asking questions. So
yeah,
maybe, yeah. Very interesting. And would you say that the mission was accomplished of the goal of American Manhunt? Maybe what was the mission besides just telling the story? And now looking 1 year out from when it was released.
Well, the mission of the Manhunt or the documentary?
No, the mission of the documentary of the American Manhunt.
Yeah. Well, I think it did really well. The numbers speak for themselves. And it was, now, like I said, there's season 2 and 3 for other Manhunt. And that's kind of like a category or a genre, and or a subgenre, which is, from not about the crime necessarily, the crime itself would prefer the crime, but it's about the chase, and there's a big audience for that. So in terms of like filmmaking and it was successful, and it created this kind of audience who wants to see the chase of something, that's to them is intriguing. And Netflix is really good at creating all these different kind of...
And I'd say it was hard to turn off as you turn that on, and you keep it going for the truth.
It's very
well, and I think still people who are younger, who maybe won't be aware of what it was, could still watch the series, years to come. And it's kind of this living, it's this document that, is a historical piece of...
So Omar talked about lone wolves, but you also talked about in fighting an idea and ideology. What did maybe you learn from talking to the teacher and different friends of these brothers that did it? How does this work? Like the two brothers who, if they were by themselves, but as you said, this now is copycatted. Loren, what did you learn from this process about terrorism in America? I know it's a broad question, but we all sort of see it from afar, but you just got to see this up close and in the ins and outs of how this, God forbid, can happen. As actually, I believe it was the Boston police chief who was quoted as saying, if people want to hurt someone, they will hurt someone. After your research.
Right, I think until the superintendent.
People wants to hurt someone, they will find ways to do it. Yeah, that's what you said. I'm
look there. You're right. It's a giant topic, and there are tons of things to learn. And I think the one thing that I learned is that it's super complex when you were trying from the FBI's perspective, from the police perspective. When you're trying to untangle it, you can never really get in the mind of someone else.
Exactly.
And what is the reason for it? Is it about ideology? Was it the mental illness? Was it, there were some things that were written in the boat that Jahar, the younger brother, scrawled that it was, revenge against America for what the U.S. government and military were doing in Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, it's almost like, come on, really?
And they often say that a rabbi's best sermon is the sermon that they do not give because there's so much material, but you only have a finite amount of time. Is there something that didn't make it into the documentary that you could share that is not hidden information, but another story that, didn't make the edits, but is really a fascinating piece of this puzzle?
Well, the boxing trainer of Tamerlan, John Allen, had tons to say. I just remember sitting in his interview and thinking, all of this is not getting in because a lot of it is tangential to the story. But certainly one of the interesting stories, and there was another documentary that went into this, was about
The murder, Waltham.
in Waltham, Massachusetts, there were 3 young men who were murdered, and there were ties to Tamerlan. Tamerlan was best friends with one of them and had trained with them, and there is speculation that he was involved and possibly killed these 3 people, and the 3 of them were Jewish.
Oh wow!
And which ties into the whole, when the boxing trainer started talking about Jewish conspiracy theories that Tamerlan had, obviously my interest was piqued, and I, what?
Yeah.
And a lot of it was very vague, and a lot of it is stereotypical, and a lot of it is things that you typically hear, that, the Jews were controlling the government, and it's the Jewish people's fault for everything that the U.S. government or the military is doing, and that we're behind it. And it's mentioned in the series, but there's a lot of other elements.
Yeah. I think that is something that, if anything, is to, as a Muslim, for me, myself, is I think education is a big one, is to, you can't prevent anything from happening, but if you want to be proactive, is when all of these, things about, the Jews control the world, and it's but unfortunately, that's not just the people that commit these acts. There's a lot of Muslims, unfortunately, that believe that, and, this is uncomfortable to say, but a lot of Muslims, I grew up, and a lot of Muslims believe, generally Jews can, and it's also, it's funny too, in a way, because also he sounds almost jealous too of Brandon Messi. He was successful, he did it, and then he's a failure. So there's kind of also rivalry and jealousy, and you feeling didn't accomplish anything, and you see, Jewish people who are successful, but then you really don't ask yourself how did they get there and how they're successful, and then you just blame it as oh, this is just, it's it's a very lazy way of thinking, and so I think that's one big thing that I feel obviously this is not what the documentary is about, but I feel to me that's something that I always try to talk about or include in anything that I work on, is like we talked about, the Muslim Christian understanding, of course, but I think what's important, especially right now, the Jewish Muslim understanding, and the geopolitical understanding, and all of these things. I think more education, because we live in a world there's so much propaganda. It's not really information.
Propaganda is education today, which is unfortunate.
And people don't really get to have this, what we're doing right now.
I think it's amazing that we're here now, even though it took a year to get us here, and maybe it was meant to be that we're here in this moment, so people can literally see that we are sitting in a room together and actually having a conversation, sometimes uncomfortable conversations, but conversations that actually need to be had. And actually, you talk about in the film, there's a Saudi suspect, right, that is dealing with Islamophobia. Was the kid arrested just because he looked like what he does? Maybe you can just talk about that for a moment. And
so that's another thing, we mentioned in the topic, and there is also the other side of it, which is, even if you read so many of the comments or so many of the, then I guess negative feedback, if you want to say negative, is we watched a series, and then we realized, the victims are the Muslims, because there's a section about Islamophobia, and I was why Muslims are crying Islamophobia. So there's a lot of hate also from the other side that, but Muslims have really that, Yusuf, one of the friends of, who felt betrayed, the Imam, who felt responsible and what could I have done,
Yes.
And so I think, bringing that perspective in the documentary is very important, but also it was important for them to be honest. You can't say, I'm not his friend, I don't know him, I didn't do anything. Right. That's also, to me, more so. And a lot of Muslims also, by the way, do that. And we try to filter through all these PR people, that you're I'm Muslim, I'm not a terrorist, I didn't know anything, and they really it doesn't help, because you really want to stop this from happening, or at least reduce it, And so I think being honest and explaining and describing how these things and who these people are and how your connection with them, it really helps, And, for these 2 brothers, at some point, they were just felt excluded, or they just excluded themselves, and kind of people dismissed it or didn't make much of it, you know. And so there were signs, but in retrospect. But I think that's another thing that, you know, it educates. It's like to see if you notice anything about, you know, people.
Right.
So I think we went in different directions with this questions because it's, you know, a big question. But I think what didn't make it in the film that I really am passionate about is this Muslim and Christian, Muslim and Jewish understanding, and that Muslims and Jews lived for hundreds of years together in peace. So this is like, it's not like it's always been like that, which is what people try to say right now, you know. Because I don't believe that. And, you know, I work with Loren, I work with my Itai, I worked with Avi, I worked with AB, I worked with so many my Jewish and even Israeli friends. And it's not the same as people want to paint it, like, you know, because when you paint one group as bad or good, this is like when you lose, like, for sure, everybody loses.
I think that's what you said about education. So I guess the last question is, how can what would be your advice, your suggestion, your wisdom to the next generation of young kids who are making their films on TikTok and etc., that want to be the next Omars and Lorens, about the education that they should get so they can tell also these important stories to use it in their lives to actually bring people together and not to divide?
Well, I think you have to get in a room with people, man. I think that, you know, the world is so different than when we grew up, and so many things are online and people are taking things at face value. Probably the best experience that I had on the project was when Omar and I were out researching, and he took me to a couple of mosques. I actually prayed at a couple of mosques. It was during Ramadan. They fed me.
They put him to work. He was helping them. You know?
That's right. I helped clean up. Omar disappeared to talk to the imam, and
we asked him here all the time. He always says
he fit. He was so perfect. And now I'm in the temple. So this is, you know,
I think that's really important people to know, right? It doesn't look like a sanctuary right here, but it's right. Loren goes to the mosque and Omar comes to the synagogue, and we're talking about, I think, issues that people think about but don't necessarily speak about, number one, intelligently, but also intellectually honestly as well.
Yeah, you can't be too intimidated, if I would say, you know what I mean? Like, you know, because I'm sure many Muslims wouldn't even want to go into a temple or wouldn't go to a church.
And the vice versa as well.
Or like if you grew up, especially with very, you know, rigid mentalities of like, but then the idea is like, what are you afraid of if you know, it just, I guess, if there is any advice is, see what you're scared of, what you're afraid of, and try to tackle that. You see any unanswered questions and try to tackle that, especially if you want to do documentaries.
Or tell any story.
Or any
right?
story.
I would say with these technological devices that every single person has, obviously you both went to school for it, but we have all become our own documentarians.
Yeah.
And so since we have that, like you said, tell that story in a way that's tackles your fears too.
Yeah, and it's not just about click. I know it's like, you know, we went to Netflix and everything, but I don't think any of us went on the project thinking, oh, we just want the viewership, or we just want the... It's like, we really care about the project, so if there's any advices, don't think about it from a businessman. There's people that do business if you want to be a businessman, but just think about what do you really care about, and then try to tell stories that you care about.
And you have to hear it before you talk, right? You have to listen first before you tell your story.
I think that is extremely valuable advice. Actually, I always teach our children our declaration of our faith is the Shema. It means to listen, but when you switch those letters around, you actually get silent. And so when you listen first, then you can begin to actually tell that story. We are so honored that you took the time to come out specifically on this day of the Boston Marathon 11 years later. Omar Al Dakheel, Loren Mendell, friends of Rabbi on the Sidelines, producers on the American Manhunt, the Boston Marathon bombing. If you have not seen it yet, it really, as Loren said, is a piece of historical evidence that is important to hear that story and to share that story with our children as well. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Rabbi on the Sidelines. Have a great day.